I cannot imagine that many of you will understand how grateful I am for that introduction and for this opportunity to speak to you under the sponsorship of this university. For it was SMU that made possible my being at the council, though the World Methodist Council was the one that appointed me as, so to say, licensed to go watch the Romans at work and play. And when President Tate feels that the job that was in fact his own assignment is reasonably well done, this is a source of very great pride and satisfaction to me. I'm also very grateful to you for being here. The notion of this many people coming to hear one man with no chorus line, no songs and dances, nothing to play on or pictures to show, talk about a great event in our time, I think is the sign of the measure of the magnitude of this event. For you are here not primarily to hear me, but to hear about an event which has in fact involved us all. The Second Vatican Council belongs now to history, and the new era that it has inaugurated in modern church history has begun. What comes next is therefore aftermath. And yet it has the excitement of history still in the making. The conciliar decrees are now fixed and final, and we can hold the Romans to them. And yet their practical significance must still be proved in the upcoming future. The promulgation of the documents of a general council is only half of the story. The other half depends upon its reception in the community of churches and in the world. What will the Roman Catholic Church make of its council now? What will the rest of Christendom make of it? And what the rest of the human community? Already the reactions to this council are so widely varied that it is hard to tell that all of them refer to the same event. There was, for example, the letter to the Oklahoma Curia, which said bluntly that the council was a flat failure. Vatican II substituted a new set of rules for an old set of trivia. It settled to satisfy the complacent, self-righteous Catholics. It did little for man suffering from too many births, too little food, too much ignorance, too inhuman a way of worship. Vatican II was a failure. Signed, Disappointed Catholic. I think I ought to put that in just to make sure you realize that this is a self-estimate I was quoting. Then there was the letter I received not very long ago, 2 weeks ago, from a Protestant bigot named Ambrose Johnson from Morristown, New Jersey. It is an absolute fact, and this is normally the way they start. It is an absolute fact that the Roman Catholic Church is positively operating, chiefly tactical, with the express intention of putting Protestants and non-Roman Catholics off their guard. It is the crystal clear intention of the Roman Church to have unification of Christians by surrender and absorption. For all Protestants to bring their wealth and assets over to the Roman Church to swell their present fabulously wealthy coffers and to extend their devastating power over all the peoples of the world. And then there are other Protestants, Professor Robert McAfee Brown, Dean Robert E. Cushman, Professor K.E. Skidsgore, and others, who saw the council at work and up close and who regard it as an unprecedented act of self-examination and reform, something that one cannot see the like of in any large ecclesiastical organization in modern times. a church turning away from its traditional triumphalism toward a more deeply biblical conception of the people of God, a church ready to offer itself to the world in witness and in loving service. But then amongst the Catholics there are traditionalists like Father Goma de Paul, whom I met in Rome last fall and discovered that psychologically speaking he is surprisingly like some of our own Protestant house wreckers. That is to say, they have antithetical notions and operate with the same set of cliches and motivations. He won't reject the authority of the council outright, and that's a gracious thing of him. But he has convinced himself that the decrees of this council can so be read as to sustain his notion of what they should have said, and so as to make it clear that they don't really mean what they do actually say they mean, because what they actually say they mean, he thinks, and he calls them Protestantizing tendencies. Over against de Paul, we can set the faintly favorable verdict of Professor Hans Küng in last week's Commonweal, and anything faintly favorable from Father Küng about the Roman Catholics comes very close to being a rave notice, because part of his vocation in life is to make it hard on his brethren. The council, says he, has certainly not done everything that it could have done. That's so. From the point of view of the present situation or of the past, but it has done a great deal more than we expected earlier, which is to say, twice nothing is plus 5. Despite real disillusionment, the council has been the fulfillment of a great hope. Incidentally, when I left Rome, there was a story going around that Cardinal Ottaviani had died and had not checked in at either purgatory or heaven. Since heaven was pleased with the cardinal's performance toward the end of the council, a search party was quickly organized to retrieve him. They found him, easily enough, up to his ears in boiling pitch, but with a fiercely triumphant gleam in his one good eye. "Your Eminence," said the leader of the rescue squad, "there's been a great mistake. You're not supposed to be here. We've come to take you straight to heaven." "Many thanks," said the cardinal, shaking his head. "Tanto grazie," they said. "But what you can't see is that I'm standing on the shoulders of Hans Küng, and I'm not moving until this stuff freezes over." Meanwhile, the shape of the post-conciliar era begins to emerge. 2 weeks ago, Pope Paul designated the coordinating commission which will supervise the implementation of the Vatican decrees. Its composition is fair warning that the progressive conservative tension will continue right on as it has for the past 5 years. The conservatives and the progressives are neatly balanced off one against the other, and the key figure turns out to be the council's general secretary, Uncle Pericles Felici, who will inevitably get his red hat at the next consistory. At the same time, however, the Secretariat for Promoting Christian Unity, which is the strongest and the most effective champion of the progressive cause in Rome, has been given permanent status and greatly enlarged quarters, which is the same thing as universal approval. Moreover, a new institute for advanced studies in ecumenism is being projected for Jerusalem to be directed by an autonomous academic council in which the Roman Catholics are, by their own motion, a minority without veto power. If this experiment works, that is, if it gains financial support from private sources so that it will not have to depend on church subventions of any sort, it will be one of the really crucial spearhead operations in the problems that still remain with us in the post-conciliar period. Any day now, you can look to hear of a new batch of new cardinals, and before Easter, the Pope is expected to announce the convocation of the first Synod of Bishops. This is a major new departure in representative policy making at the summit. The terms and agenda of this first session of the Synod will be worth watching as a clue to the practical meaning of the doctrine of collegiality. They have the doctrine of episcopal collegiality, that all bishops everywhere share in the governance of the church. Watch how this Synod of Bishops is conceived and how it works, and then you will know what the theoretical notion of collegiality really will mean in practice. Now, all of this is to say that the real meaning of Vatican II is still by way of being determined. The Council changed the atmosphere within the Roman Catholic Church and between Rome and the other churches, and it stirred the interests and hopes of a multitude of men. But it must finally be judged by its working, and this will turn upon the way in which its 16 documents are understood as charters for change and as guidelines for the future. Now, we Protestants are so accustomed to radical breaches with our past, we normally call it progress, that we find it difficult to appreciate how complex and unsettling the problem of change is for men who are deeply immersed in their historical heritages and who cherish them, the Roman Catholics, the Orthodox. It therefore requires a special effort of imagination and understanding for us to see how changes in ancient and solid traditions raise for Roman Catholics the ghost of error in the church. If the past can be corrected or surpassed as readily and as easily as the vote of a council of bishops, then what does this mean to the present generation about lurking errors that may still be there, or that may be in the new thing that has been put in place of what had been thought to be stable before? What does this do to the theory of a perfect and wholly reliable deposit of the whole Christian system in the one true church? To be sure, one can allow for changes that are no more than the completion of partially developed truths. What was there but what was not understood to be there, what was there but had not actually been unfolded. But what are you going to do with real changes? Changes that alter or correct long-standing traditions of teaching. These generate chain reactions of anxiety with respect to the teaching authority of the church. Now, this is what happened at Vatican II, and this is one of the great problems that Vatican II has bequeathed to the Roman Catholics and to the rest of us. You see, this council differed from previous councils chiefly in being predominantly pastoral in its concern. Pope John made it quite clear that he wanted no new dogmas pronounced and no old anathemas reheated. Pope Paul took up this same motif and carried it forward. But even the most commonplace pastoral problems root back in doctrinal and moral reflections. Men cannot speak as pastors, neither to their own flocks nor to those not of this fold, without some appropriate theoretical context. And so when you start updating pastoral perspectives and pastoral methods, you also find yourself updating doctrinal statements and moral theories, and this in turn is bound to produce mutations which can be called developments only in order to make it as easy on you as possible. It was on this point more than any other that the conflicts of the council turned. The immobilists were quick to spot any new idea at all, even when what it was an old idea revived. And when they saw a new idea, they went charging into the forum crying, "Innovation!" And whenever they did that, the progressives would shudder, because everybody agreed that innovation is theoretically wrong and psychologically fatal. And so the progressives would deny that it really is innovation. It is development, and you must understand the difference between development and innovation. And if you don't, come and let us talk it over some more. This is called dialogue. But the fact is that some of the developments amounted to modifications of long-standing traditions of official teaching and practice. And on this point, the diehards were dead right. They drew the wrong conclusions, but they had their facts right from which to draw their wrong conclusions. And yet it was just these developments, which sooner or later might just as well be called changes, and then get it over with. It was these changes that constituted the very genius of Vatican II and that have set the agenda for the post-conciliar era. Now, the obvious strategy for the traditionalist is to minimize the changes where they can, veto them where they must, in the name of a full and unchanging deposit of truth. On the other hand, the progressive strategy still depends on what they can do in implementing these charters for change until they become commonplace, which is to say, traditional again. There are therefore two ways in which the achievements of Vatican II can be stultified. One is by nullification, on purpose, or by neglect. The other is by a failure to develop an adequate theory for these changes, which will allow not only for these changes, but for a continuing and cumulative dynamism in the church for this generation and the next generation and any generation yet to come. In short, for the Roman Catholics to develop something that looks very much like what Protestants used to talk about in the Semper Reformanda, the church always in the process of change, because it is always in the process of the dynamic thrust of the power and will of God. It seems to me, therefore, that one of the best ways to understand Vatican II, both as past event and as source for the creative confusions that are still in store, is to focus on these points of significant change and to ask about their import for the future. The council began on the 8th of October 1962 with a sprawling agenda of 71 schemata, all in varying stages of immaturity. The first session saw nothing finished, but toward its close on the 4th of December, Cardinal Sunens and Montini, prompted by Pope John, proposed a focus for all the sprawling and unorganized issues of the council. And this in terms of three correlated questions. What has the church to say to herself about herself? What does the church have to say to other Christians about the unity of the Christian community? And three, what does the church have to say to the world about righteousness, peace, and human welfare? And you can read the whole literature of the council in terms of its subsequent efforts to take these questions seriously and to answer them in terms of self-understanding and of understanding between the Christian churches and understanding between the Christian community and the human community. The 71 schemata were then regrouped into a new agenda of 13 different documents, and these then had to be enlarged later to 16, which was the final number. Of these 16 documents, there are 3 dogmatic constitutions, one on the sacred liturgy, one on the church, and one on divine revelation. There is one pastoral constitution, and this is a new thing in the way of constitutions, not dogmatic enough to be dogmatic, and yet they didn't want to minimize its importance and call it just a decree, so they invented a notion of a pastoral constitution, something terribly important, but it hasn't quite gelled yet. That's the general notion of pastoral constitution. This is the church in today's world. And I put it that way. It's usually translated the church in the modern world or the church in the world of today. But the church in today's world, I think, suggests this huius temporis bit, that the church in any today has to understand and speak to the human community. Then there were 7 decrees and 5 declarations. Incidentally, the declarations were supposed not to be quite as important as the decrees, and the decrees not quite as important as the pastoral constitution not quite as important as the dogmatic constitutions, and yet 2 of the declarations are the ones on which the council really did turn in its time and will turn in its aftermath. Now, most of these 16 documents deal with the Roman Catholic Church's self-understanding. The church at worship, the church in her essence and order and mission, the church understanding the ground of her authority, the church governed by bishops and how the hierarchy is to dispose itself, etc., etc., etc. One decree and one declaration tackle the business of what does the church have to say, what does the Roman Catholic Church have to say to other Christian churches? The decree on ecumenism and the declaration on religious liberty. The result of these decrees, declarations, and the corresponding section on ecumenism in the Constitution on the Church and the decree on missionary activity have had as the result a reopening of the ecumenical dialogue between Rome and the rest of Christendom after centuries of sullen silence punctuated by growls, pious growls. In the Declaration on Religious Liberty and the church in today's world and the Declaration on the habitude or the attitude of Catholics toward the non-Christian religions, the Council speaks a loving word to all men of goodwill in the name of human dignity and authentic community. Now, all of these documents reflect one degree or another of development. That is to say, they are refinements of existing traditions. By the same token, even the most progressive of them come out of a deep sense of rootage in the Catholic tradition. But there are at least 7 points on which it seems to me we can notice significant change from what had been the tradition and practice of the Roman Catholic Church for at least 200 years before the Vatican Council. And that is long enough for most people to feel that they are dealing with, the tradition. Now, the most obvious change comes in the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, and it is the switch from Latin to the vernacular. Now, it can be argued, and rightly, that this is the restoration of an ancient tradition. that once Latin was the vernacular. And a fair number of people had a great deal of trouble learning enough Latin to say the Mass, and finally some of them just gave it up. And so you get what Robert Browning referred to as the blessed mutter of the Mass. Now, there is a book of cartoons about the council. One of the things I came to like so much about the Roman Catholics is the extraordinary sense of self-directed humor. This is a picture of a congregation belting out one of the newfangled hymns. And you can see that they're enjoying it, but it's a new experience. And in the center, there's a little old biddy with her rosary in her hand, and the caption under it says, "How's a body to tell her beads with all this yakking going on?" Now, the deepest thing in this change, however, is not the switch from one language to another, but the understanding of the liturgy itself. Liturgy in this Constitution now marks a shift from an essentially private affair of congregated individuals to the notion of the sacramental miracle that transforms a group of alienated people, alienated from God and alienated from themselves and alienated from each other, which is a reasonably fair description of a congregation on Sunday morning, the transformation of such a group into a band of brothers by means of communion with God, who comes and makes himself present in their company. Here, you see, is a significant change and a significant charter for further changes in sacramental theology, at least compared to the sacramental theology that has been in vogue for the last 2 or 3 centuries. Again, there is in the Constitution on the Church the compound notion of the Church as mystery, therefore beyond all human sovereignty, the Church as the people of God, therefore a general priesthood with a universal call to witness and to holy living, and the Church as governed not simply by the Bishop of Rome, but by the entire College of Bishops, and therefore representative and local, not centralized and absolute. Such a conception of the Church in this form has no precedent in the history of Christian doctrine, but it is bound to have far-reaching consequences not yet fully foreseeable. Third, the decree on ecumenism marks a decisive change from both popular Catholic belief and official papal teaching. For as late as 1928, or as early as 1928, the papal encyclical Mortalium Animos specifically declined for the Roman Catholics to participate in the ecumenical movement then or thereafter on any other terms except return and surrender. My friend Johnson's suspicion. He's held it ever since, though I think he had it before. This is now in the decree on ecumenism changed so that there is an open and explicit recognition and acknowledgement of the ecclesial reality of other Christian churches, and there is a description of other Christian traditions that is the sort of understanding and a gracious thing that I do not know of our having been able to do yet about the Romans. On ecumenism is not a charter for church unity negotiations. This will come later, maybe much later. But it is a milestone from which further progress can be measured and guided. Number 4, there never was any doubt that the schema on religious liberty was the test case for the progressive cause in the council. It was fought over 4 years with some of the most extraordinary kinds of drama I have ever myself seen at work or had a little finger in. It is the most carefully drafted of all the 16 documents because it was fought over comma by comma, preposition by preposition, and was rewritten, and every time it was rewritten, here were both sides poised to see if anybody had tampered with their most precious notion. You see, the one thing that the conservatives had to have in it was the statement that the Roman Catholics believed themselves to be the true church. Well, that's fair enough and is quite explicitly the case, so long as it was in that particular form. The one thing that the progressives insisted on was that religious liberty not amount to toleration of error, but the actual acknowledgement of the right and duty of independent judgment, both in faith and in the expression of faith. The thing was twice derailed, and then in the end it polled 70 negative votes out of 2,300 plus. And these 70 have now been named the Septuagint. The immobilist insisted that its teaching was contrary to Scripture, contrary to tradition, and contrary to papal teaching. They were wrong about Scripture, I think, but they were right about tradition as far back as Augustine is concerned, and they were right about papal tradition as far back as Gregory the 16th. And that's enough for any sound tradition. None of us has anything half that long or half that stable. Now, what was at stake is not merely the condemnation of religious persecution. Deeper still is the far-reaching theological implication of the recognition that rival claims to Christian truth do exist and must be settled, not by arbitrary authority of any kind, but in a fair forum in an open society. Over here, you see, is the ancient Scylla of dogmatism, and over here is the ancient Charybdis of indifferentism. And the progressives are passionately phobic about dogmatism, and the conservatives are horrified at the thought of indifferentism, and the decree on ecumenism is the charter for making that tricky passage navigable, if it can indeed be, and I think it can. The Declaration on the non-Christian religions represents also another change, a fifth one. And this was the happy outcome of the bitterest conflict in the council, which has been recounted in an inaccurate and misleading article in a recent issue of Look by Mr. Joseph Roddy, who is an excellent writer, and with better data he could have made a better article. Now, in addition to the vicious political propaganda that swirled about it, there was the immobilist charge that this change from the ancient way of talking about the relation of Christianity and other religions was a departure from tradition, and it was therefore unwarranted. But that was the question. Of all the crises in the council, this got closest to the marrow of sheer prejudice. And in the showdown, there was no prudent option left. There wasn't any, so to say, simple and reasonable compromise that would give a little and take a little and fix everybody up. And the bishops had finally to vote their consciences. And the majority topped 93%. And this in the face of one of the oldest of the canards that Christians have themselves been guilty of. Incidentally, the dropping of the word deicide from that text was not a weakening of the statement. It had become a shibboleth to partisans on both sides and therefore dangerously equivocal. What the decree does is to describe anti-Semitism in action and then to condemn it unequivocally. Two more important instances of mutation of traditional teaching appear in the pastoral constitution on the church in today's world. That constitution was itself an unprecedented experiment in trying to formulate and communicate the Roman Catholic Church's understanding of and concern for her secular environment. Traditionally, the Roman Church has stood before the world and said, "Come to us if you want to know what's what." Here they go very far beyond the bounds of their habits, or our habits for that matter, in trying to comprehend and express in the world and to the world and for the world the church's concern for human well-being. It is not, I think, a masterwork in the history of Christian social ethics. They were undertaking too much, it seems to me, to be expected to turn out something that would be imperishable. But it is a landmark in the Roman Catholic Church's involvement in man's hungers and hopes in a world in agony. In the section on war and peace, there is a virtual abandonment of the medieval doctrine of the just war in favor of a moderate pacifism that is neither doctrinaire nor yet quite utopian. The new theory has the same intent as the old, namely to mitigate the horrors of war. But the shift is great enough to prompt a reconsideration of a good deal of the tradition in this problem since the Crusades. In the section on marriage and the family, there is what may come one day to amount to a drastic change in the traditional teaching of the Latin Church since Augustine on the primary end of conjugal love. Cardinal Ruffini, who made 30 speeches all told in the council, he spoke more often than any other man, and all 30 speeches in opposition to something or other, made the point with respect to the doctrine of marriage that since Augustine the Church has taught consistently that sex has only one legitimate end and purpose, and that is procreation. And this is the fundamental objection to any sort of contraception. And here we come finally to the one great unresolved issue of Vatican II, birth control, which some of us think of as its greatest failure. What they were looking for was an ideal or perfect solution, and they couldn't find it. And so in the absence of an ideal solution that would depend upon an ideal form of either anovulation or precisely timed ovulation, they chose to stand by their old tradition. But in standing by the old tradition, what they also did was to recognize that there are compound aims and values in love and marriage, procreation and interpersonal communion, and both are primary and both are, so to say, interrelated, but they're not identical. And this means that somebody is going to have to keep on thinking furiously. For once you have altered the doctrine of the single aim of conjugal love, then the theoretical possibilities of reconceiving the meaning of sex and procreation within the context of marriage opens up, and the end is not yet in sight. Probably the solution will come when medicine comes at the problem from the angle of precisely timed ovulation instead of anovulation, which would allow for conception only when intended instead of consciously intended contraception, which is not the same thing at all. No one yet knows how these Vatican charters will be translated into action and how far they will move the Roman Catholic Church to further changes, or what impact all of this will have on the Christian community as a whole or on the human community. The Council itself captured the public imagination as no other event in church history in our time. But who will follow it up, and how far? The first factor in follow-up will be getting the documents read and interpreted and their essential imperatives communicated to as many people as possible in the Roman Church and out of it. The documents are now widely accessible. They've been printed in diocesan papers, most of them in the New York Times. In April, a volume of all the documents with official translations, commentaries by Catholics and Protestants will appear under the joint aegis of the Paulist Press and the Association Press. And one way and another, similar publishing programs are in train in other countries. In many dioceses, there are plans afoot for little councils to repeat at home something of the experience of the council in Rome. And the whole thing is looking toward the business of getting the council to the community and parish level, where study and service projects can be developed in which Catholics and non-Catholics learn to think and to work and to worship in mutual understanding and trust. And this is beginning to happen quite literally all over. Now, another crucial factor in the post-conciliar follow-up will be the leadership patterns of the Pope. The art of Pope watching, a perennial fascination in Rome and to the Catholics, has now become an important interest for any and all ecumenists. I offer you here a thumbnail sketch mostly to suggest our need for a life-size portrait. It was, of course, Pope John who begat the council, but it has been Pope Paul who carried it through to a success it could scarcely have had otherwise, and this precisely because Pope Paul is a deep-dyed conservative in matters of doctrine and church discipline over on this side, and yet over on this side, an imaginative and courageous progressive in questions of polity and administration. He will have no tampering with the traditional doctrines or with the traditional practice, clerical celibacy, and everybody was excited, and there was a great deal of talk, and presently Uncle Pericles read to the bishops that the Pope would just soon, they would be quiet. Reminded me of a visit out to the monastery of San Nilo at Grottaferrata, where there are Greeks who have maintained the Greek language and the Greek chants and the Greek liturgy right there between the summer home of the Pope and the Vatican since the 11th century. And we were taken out for luncheon in the refectory. Over the door of the refectory in Uncials, there was the Greek word sipe, and I was terribly proud that I could, tell what it was and that it meant silence. And so I spoke to one of the brothers. They come largely, you see, from South Italy, where there are Greek-speaking Roman Catholic churches. And these people learned their English from GIs headed up from Sicily. And he had already startled me with some of his, not quite Italianate expressions. And so I pointed up to him and I said, sipe. This means silence. No, says he, means shut up. Pope Paul's passion for solidarity tempers his zeal for progress, but it doesn't quench it. He is not at all indecisive. What happens is that he can see all the options in any given issue about twice as fast as anybody else, and this creates a great deal of anxiety and temporary indecision. He also sees all of the competing claims, and he also listens to everybody, which is a very doubtful virtue in an administrator, though one I cherish very much since I'm normally in the minority. But then when he finally comes to the decision, it almost always has the accent of an inspiration that he has himself supplied, something quite unexpected and something very much more than a simple resultant of all the pressures that zero in on the fourth floor of the apostolic palace. He is very tender with the feelings of the immobilists. Therefore, after he has seen them bulldozed back into by the progressive majority, he thinks somebody ought to care for them. But he declines to give them the veto. That is what they really want. His trusted lieutenants still come from the conservative side, Cicognani, Tisserand, Felici, who now becomes the man to watch, for he's the youngest in this crop. The other ones are ripening for glory. But watch Felici. He's the youngest man in this group, and his star has been rising. But this same Pope has also begun internationalizing the College of Cardinals. He has set up the Synod of Bishops. He has participated in a service of common prayer with the observers, despite very strong dissuasion from the people who said, if you do this, they will get the idea that they are good as we are, and what is worse, some of our people will get that idea, and what will we do then? He exasperates those who want Rome reformed by Friday, and he annoys the journalists who work on the principle, let's you and them fight. He cannot, for reasons that I think are intelligible, he cannot enchant people like Pope John did. And this was a great mercy, because Pope John's enchanting of people meant that he did not always have to run the actual machinery that is in train when you have an enchantment going. Well, there are immobilists and progressives who join in predicting that Pope Paul will try to turn the clock back from the hours that were struck in Vatican II. There's an Argentine archbishop whom I know slightly from Mendoza, who has said now that Paul let the council go through with its play acting at reform, but now he will go to work setting things back to rights quietly, just as they were in the good old days before Roncalli. Now, this is nonsense, but it is nonsense that can be believed, because it is perfectly clear that Pope Paul is not going simply to rush on into aggiornamento without looking twice and making 3 or 4 divagations here and there. What he's going to do is to go on in the pattern of cautious reform, open to new ideas and new dimensions of ecumenism, but quite immune to extremism. For example, when Vatican II began, Cardinal Montini's concept of ecumenism was modeled on Mortalium Animos. His stereotype of Protestantism was borrowed from the only really bad book Jacques Maritain ever wrote. Montini translated it into Italian. In the course of the council, however, this very same man came to develop a new kind of ecumenical understanding as quickly as anybody else I know. His dealings with the observers went very far beyond the demands or patterns of Italian hospitality, which is very great, and Christian courtesy, which was quite literally beyond description at the council. But at the same time, he insists on a visible symbol and agency of unity in the Christian community, and the only one he can think of is the papacy. Can you think of another one? He now affirms, however, that authentic unity need not be monolithic nor uniformitarian, And this means that he has come to take pluralism seriously, which is an extraordinary thing to have happened in 5 years. Now, given this kind of perspective and a decade or more of development, and the shape of eventual recomposition of Christian unity may become visible. A plurality of churches in full communion with each other, with diverse rites and institutional organizations, but still one in Christ, one church but multiform, Catholic, evangelical, and Reformed. There's no immediate prospect of this, for all of us need a lot more growing up and growing together before we are ready for the risks of reunion. Meanwhile, however, we can get on with the obvious and urgent projects of mutual Christian witness and service in the joint defense of human dignity, peace, and well-being. Little good will come of impatience, but none at all from apathy. And this brings me to the final point. What about non-Roman Catholics in the aftermath of Vatican II? Well, the first part of this, of the answer to this question is that in its own way, Vatican II is a charter for change for us, too, without meaning to be. For the blunt truth is that with this council, the Roman Catholic Church has leapfrogged the rest of us on at least 2 fronts: church renewal and ecumenical action. And it must also be said that thus far Protestant reactions have been a good deal less enthusiastic than one might have supposed they would have been if one had supposed they would have been enthusiastic at all. The stance of the World Council of Churches has varied from wary to mulish. Among the Orthodox churches, only the ecumenical patriarch has been warmly affirmative, and this amounts to less than it might because of the tragically precarious situation of the patriarch Athenagoras, one of the really great Christians of modern times. Among the non-Roman churches in the West, only the Anglicans have moved much to make much positive out of the new situation. The Methodists did reasonably well at the council, but at the top levels of church administration, we've already muffed at least 3 significant fielding chances, and one hopes they won't bat any more to us right soon until we get the hang of the new situation. But there's finally no evading of the challenge of Vatican II that we go and do likewise with our equivalents of renewal and reform. Now, as far as these words go, this is all old hat to us. Now, we've been talking about church renewal for years. Haven't talked about much else that I can remember. But now the Romans, who were, as we had thought, safely in their ghetto, the Romans have gone and got going with an adventure in reform and renewal while we are still busy with our verbal isometrics, where you stretch the muscles but don't leave the room. Many of our reformers are actually malcontents, handier at dismantling an existing institution than imagining what you could replace it with, short of a church in the catacombs or one of the ancient mystery cults. On the other side, our immobilists are at least as intransigent as their Roman counterparts, and what is worse, they are in the majority and in very firm and determined control of their or our ecclesiastical organizations. Given these upper and nether millstones, it is small wonder that we have a crisis of morale in the Protestant ministry. Moreover, at the very time when constructive theology is having an exciting revival among the Romans, Protestantism is in the throes, temporary I think, of an acute theological colic, and this is scarcely edifying to our Roman brethren who are now newly interested in Protestant thought. If, for example, you lay Henri Delubac's book on atheism beside the essays of our self-appointed morticians to the Almighty, you might be, as I am, embarrassed for our side. But the mindless outcry of their critics is not very promising either. If pitiless self-criticism and vigorous bickering between the drivers and the driven were any real aid toward renewal and reform, contemporary Protestantism would surely be on the verge. But something more is required of us, and this is what the Romans did, at least in part, in Vatican II. The reopening of the springs and sources of faith itself, the vital sense of the reality and presence of God in our lives, in our histories, in our destiny, the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, whose judgments and grace and imperatives are the first and final ground of our existence. Failing a renewal of authentic evangelical religion, we may be nearer the end of the Protestant era than we had thought, but by default and not transfiguration. Vatican II poses still another challenge to us with respect to our traditional negativism toward Rome. Our forefathers took their stand as Protestants before an unreformed and irreformable Roman Catholic Church, and for 4 centuries we have been justified in that stand by Roman immobilism and triumphalism. After the wars of religion, this then developed into a very cozy arrangement in predominantly Protestant countries. The Romans in their ghettos and the Protestants proprietors of what Paul Tillich, somewhat with unconscious irony, called the Protestant principle. The primacy of faith, the authority of Scripture, and the purgation of all idols. Now let's skip the awkward question of how Protestants have been judged by this principle. What is sobering is to notice that Vatican II has taken the Roman Catholic Church a giant step toward the recovery of this very same evangelical tendency. Now, what if Rome goes on developing the motifs in what is now called her new theology, the primacy of faith, the authority of Scripture, and the purgation of all idols? What would happen to our anti-Roman defense mechanisms and our rationalizations of them? It's just as well that the hour is gone and that we leave this as an open question, for it is an open question and will not be disposed of by wishful thinking on our side or theirs. 3 years ago, when the issue was in honest doubt, I did a little piece that looks more knowledgeable now than it did then. What if Vatican II succeeds? My answer then was threefold. The noses of the immobilists on both sides will be put out of joint. 2, the Romans will find themselves in a fine confusion of transition and change for which they are ill prepared. 3, non-Roman Christians will find themselves confronted with the hard choice of shaping up or falling behind. Now, Vatican II has succeeded beyond the hopes of the small cadre of optimists in the beginning. And it has so happened. The immobilist noses are out of joint. The Romans are in a fine flurry of confusion, and we are before a very hard choice of shaping up or falling behind. But now we can ask the same question in a different context. What if they do actually go on succeeding with their post-conciliar charters for change? What if Vatican II does not remain a paper council? What if they do get with it? And then we're really up against it. Now, it is not certain that this will happen, so that we do not really have to be anxious yet. The bishops are gone from Rome, and so are the observers. The hardcore diehards are still there, dug into their curio foxholes. They are powerful, they are shrewd, they are undiscourageable, they'll never give up, and they'll never go quietly. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, there is a veritable rash of what looks to old-timers like mutiny in the ranks. Berrigan and Vizard from the left, and DePaul from the right, volleying and thundering. It should surprise no one that many a bishop has begun to wonder what to do with this Pandora's box that they've gone and pried open. We cannot therefore be certain that the aftermath of Vatican II will match the event itself. What is certain, though, is that something momentous is stirring in the Roman Catholic Church, that there is a vast company of Catholics, intellectuals, professional people, bishops, priests, sisters, layfolk, for whom Vatican II has now come to be a new lease on life and who have a huge stake in its successful implementation. Between them, they have tremendous resources of talent and dedication. Their morale is high. Their day, they think, is dawning. It is therefore too soon to cast up anything like a final account of Vatican II. We must go on watching this strange upwelling of the tides of the Spirit in the Roman Catholic Church, and not as passive spectators either. We too have a stake in their success. None of us will gain by their failure. It is instead for us to join with them in all the good causes that we can and they can, to keep up all the pressures we can on all the barriers that are still up, and still also to get on with our own tasks in God's vineyard, but not now in hostile rivalry. For in so doing, we can best prepare ourselves for the excitements and the frustrations that come with every bid for a better day, always mindful that Vatican II is planted and we may help water, but it is the one God to whom we must look for the increase.